Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and we are here for my First Stand 2025 Primer and Power Rankings video. It is finally time for the first big international tournament of 2025 of this new format of all of these new regions. We've covered almost all of the teams at this tournament this entire year. We've covered the LTA, the LEC, the LCK, and the LPL all year long, as we typically do. The only region that we haven't covered all the way through is the LCP, but I promise we'll be talking about the representative in today's video. I'm just very excited to finally get into some international competition. It is happening a lot earlier in the year than it normally does, which gives us a little bit of a preview, but this is a rather short international tournament, a little bit of a, round robin style, I guess main stage, group stage, if you will, to qualify the top 4 for the bracket, and then it's just a simple single elimination bracket to see who the champions are. That doesn't really give a lot of wiggle room for quite a lot of these teams, but in today's video, what we're going to be doing is going through all 5 teams at the tournament. We're going to be going in order of who I think the weakest team at the tournament is, all the way to who I think the strongest team at the tournament is. We will kind of be giving some predictions along the way, but for the most part, when you're looking at these power rankings where I talk about where I think these teams fall from number 1 to number 5, like that's going to explain where I think they're going to finish at this tournament. The team I think is number 1, I think is going to win the tournament. The team I think is number 5, I think will be the team eliminated in the group stage. All of that will be in this video. I hope you guys are excited. I know I am. If you are, let me know down in the comments section below. I'm going to be giving a lot of opinions in today's video, but some of them are going to be different from yours. They're definitely not going to be like 100% like you definitely feel the same way I do. I'm going to be talking about all of these players and how I felt watching their tape, going in depth on what I think their play styles could be and where I think their ceilings and their floors are, like where I think they could land at this tournament in a best or a worst case scenario. But of course, let me know what your thoughts are down in the comments section below as well. A couple of housekeeping things at the beginning here. Typically speaking, for these big international tournaments, for these primer videos, I would personally power rank the players amongst, their own positions. So like the number 1 top laner and the number 2 top laner, and I'd be going over that for each role. It didn't really feel applicable though to this tournament because honestly, most of the teams kind of fit into their own little box. Like, not trying to spoil too much here, but there are a couple of teams that would just have number 1 or number 2 in every role with how few teams there are at this tournament. There was a team that would probably have close to number 5 in every role, just again with how few teams there are at the tournament. I don't think it accurately displayed the power level of a lot of these players and of these teams in comparison, and so I'm not going to be ranking the players. You'll get a pretty decent idea of where I personally rank these players as I talk about them throughout this video, but again, most of this will be talking about the teams themselves and how I think they will perform. So without further ado, let's jump right into the content. Let's jump into the analysis. Like I said, we're going to be going from number 5 in my power rankings to number 1. So we're going to be starting with the team that I personally project will be getting eliminated in the group stage, will not make the semifinals, if you will, in the bracket stage. And that for me was a pretty easy choice. Unfortunately, it is going to go to CTBC Flying Oyster of the LCP. I'm really glad that this team made it, and honestly, I'm going to talk about them. This team is much better than I think a lot of people are going to give them credit for. They're about as strong as any great team to come out of the PCS over the past couple of years. I really do think that there are a lot of things to like about this team in terms of their well-roundedness, but there are also quite a few flaws, and just generally, I think that there is going to be a lack of individual skill to be able to compete with the upper echelon of teams at this tournament. But again, if they ended up doing better than number 5, I'm not going to be the most surprised in the world. This is clearly the best team in the LCP, and you can't necessarily say that for every single team representing their region at this tournament. So let's go ahead and go over what their lineup looks like. First of all, up on the screen, what you can see, of course, the team, the region that they're from, in this case, LoL Championship Pacific, the LCP, the 5 starter members. Rest has an asterisk next to him. We'll get to that in just a second, and their 3 most played champions throughout the split. Again, no player rankings here just because it's very binary with 5 teams at the tournament. We'll be talking about them in that regard as we go throughout, but CFO's lineup is looking like Rest/Driver in the top lane. That's why the asterisk is there, because they are really the only team at this tournament actively using a 6th team member, and trust me, they will use him. We'll talk about that when we, get to the top side. Junjia in the jungle, Hongq in the mid lane, Doggo at AD carry, and Kai Wing at support. A lot of these players are going to be pretty familiar to people who follow international competition or have followed the LPL for a little while. Junjia, obviously a very well-known name in the not only PCS, APAC community, but, from the LPL, from his time on Edward Gaming. Doggo has spent the last few years in the LPL LPL. He just made his way back to the LCP and to the APAC region and immediately ended up winning the league and representing the region at this tournament after being such a hyped prospect and being snatched up by the LPL many years ago. Kaiwing is a name that a lot of people are going to be familiar with from international performances in years past. Even players like Rest and Driver are certainly not unfamiliar names. Hongq, really the only player that's relatively unknown, and I think that's what makes Flying Oyster so interesting is they actually play around him in the late game a lot more than you would expect in terms of like the names on this team. Their identity is actually incredibly clear, and that's why I do think I like this team, like in the grand scheme of things, just maybe not in the confines of a tournament where everybody else is like the number one team in their region. Doggo and Kaiwing were easily the best bot lane in terms of the 2v2 in the LCP. It wasn't even remotely close. Doggo was absolutely dominating people early on in the 2v2. This is the version of him that got so much hype and got him to come over to the LPL and quite frankly stay there for so many years. It's because his laning at, a slightly smaller level than the LPL is just absolutely ridiculous. He was already a pretty average and like slightly above average laner in the LPL. It was just everything else he really struggled with. He goes over to the LCP. He is massacring that region in terms of what he's able to do in his early games, even on champions like Kai'Sa, which I think is really impressive. So Doggo's been great. Kaiwing has definitely been able to help out with that. Kaiwing is a very big roam type of player. Think Core JJ, like as a playstyle comparison. I know it's funny because we'll talk about him a bit later in the video, but like that sort of style where he's at his best when he's able to move around the map and create a lot of action and panic for other teams. They really work well in that regard, and Doggo is just so adept at being able to generate early leads. Oftentimes, he is the one that they are going to play around in terms of their skirmishes and in terms of the objectives that they want to prioritize. Obviously, no lane swaps anymore. That is dead in the water, but for Doggo, like, you can absolutely just play around Dragon now and just have that basically every game, or at least that's what the case was for them in the LCP. They were so adept at getting those objectives because they have a jungler who prioritizes them and because they had a bot lane who was winning so consistently. So that's definitely a huge positive. And then I think when I talk about clearly defined roles, that's where the middle of the map comes in. Junjia and Hongq have really been this team's like late game insurance policy. Hongq in particular has been an exceptional team fighter, like truly a very, very good 5v5 player. He is actively able to take over games that I just don't think are perfect setups for him to be able to win in. He was probably their most important player in their playoff run down the stretch in terms of how he was playing, and I think that gave me a lot of confidence because he was the one player that I had the least amount of knowledge and experience covering on this channel, but for him to be so integral towards their success did give me hope that like, oh, it's not just like an anchor in the mid lane that, you're playing around your star players. You're playing around Junjia, Doggo, like Kaiwing. You're not just playing around those guys. Hongq is very much a big reason why this team is at this tournament, and I think that is also a pretty gigantic positive, obviously, overall for him. Junjia doesn't have the stats that you would necessarily expect, but again, a lot of that is because he does play for objectives and he does play for his laners. I think he could stand to be a little bit more aggressive. That's always been the case with Junjia, but there's a reason this guy wins the, PCS and the LCP every single year, why he wins the title in APAC every single year, and it's because his style is just tailor-made to be able to take advantage of players that don't have the macro to keep up with him. Now, how much is that going to translate to international tournaments? He has struggled at places like Worlds in the past couple of years, despite the fact that he's been able to dominate his own domestic region, and a lot of that is because I think he does rely on his opponent kind of being worse than him. I don't know how well that's going to translate. I do think there are some real concerns with Junjia, but at the end of the day, his team fighting, especially on tanks, is still exceptional. Things like Wukong he's also really, really good at, and Hongq is really proven to be a primary carry. Doggo is really good at getting resources. Like, this is a really good setup overall for CFO. I really like clearly defined roles for a team that does have some issues. The problem for me is that topside has definitely been a gigantic question mark, and this really is a split. I want to make it clear. Like, I have Rest listed here because he is the one that's listed first on their depth chart, like on Leaguepedia, but this is like a true 50-50 split. We're talking Rest played 5 games in the regular season, Driver played 5 games in the regular season. If you go and watch their finals against Talon, Rest played the first 2 games and Driver played the last 2 games. Like, this is truly a 50-50 split on the top side, and it does kind of bring down this team, not only because I'm not really a fan of 6-man rosters. I think historically speaking, they've not been successful at a high level. I think it's just better to have 5 guys that get super used to playing with each other and communicating with each other in order to like actually have success internationally, but also because I think one of these top laners is way better than the other, and obviously they are different players with different roles. This really is like a sword and shield dynamic. Rest is definitely your shield. He's definitely your tank player. He's the one who's going to pull out Ornn and K'Sante and, and Bessa to a lesser extent a lot more consistently. They're not going to play for him on the top side. They're not going to try to put him in matchups that he's supposed to win. And honestly, he hasn't really paid that back out. He's not a particularly dominant carry. He's been okay as a weak side top laner, but generally speaking, he is definitely the weaker of these two top laners. Driver, the player who's not listed on this graphic, is better. Like in almost every capacity, he is just a better top laner. He's much more aggressive. He's able to win his 1v1s a lot more consistently. Even in more negative matchups, he was definitely better than a lot of the other LCP top laners domestically. I'm shocked that they continue to go for this 6-man roster because I do think just putting Driver in would make them better, but clearly they see something either in scrims or in terms of communications that lead them to believe that the safety that Rest brings on weak side is worth at least having in certain games and in certain matchups. We'll see if they want to prioritize a weak side top laner instead of somebody that could be a little bit more volatile and a little bit more aggressive in Driver, now that they are just going up against players that are better than them because they are the major underdogs at this tournament. They are the weakest region represented at this tournament, and they definitely need to kind of be on their A game in order to pick up an upset. Like, it would be an upset if they made top 4 here, but we'll see if that incentivizes them to play Driver more because he gives you more upside, or if that incentivizes them to play Rest because you want to try to mitigate the mistakes that could be made on the top side. I think it's interesting either way. I think this team's upside goes down a ton with Rest playing. I think Driver is actually the kind of player that could really abuse some good matchups on the top side, so we'll see how that ends up going. If it's a 50-50 split, I think that plays against the favor of CFO, and that's a reason why I'm holding them down. That added on to the fact that I just don't know if they're going to be able to find the same kind of leads that they had domestically. Like, Doggo and Kaiwing were so clearly better than every other bot lane that they were going into. That's not going to be the case at this tournament. Like, spoiler alert for the rest of this list, the bot lane is the best position at this tournament. It's like AD carry is so stacked at this tournament at first stand that it's going to be difficult for Doggo to be able to gain those same leads. Like, even in the LPL, he was like an average to slightly above average AD carry. He would be, in my opinion, worse in terms of consideration. He would rank as number 5 in the AD carry role amongst the ADCs at this tournament, and that's because the other ones are all really good with incredible mechanics. And if Doggo can't get those leads in the early game, I think that does slow down the tempo and put more pressure on someone like Junjie, who already doesn't have like the most unbelievable early games in the entire world. He's definitely much safer in terms of how he wants to play these games out. Like, overall, their strategy does revolve on them being able to keep up mechanically and be able to get to the parts of the game where Junjie and Hongq can kind of take it home for them and have Doggo with a lot of resources. If that's not going to be the case, this team is going to struggle a lot more. But I could see a universe in which these players are just better than what I'm giving them credit for. That Doggo and Kaiwing actually are able to compete with the Western bot lanes, like are able to compete with Yeon and Core JJ and Kalist and Targamas. Like, if that's a universe that does end up existing, that's gigantic for CFO, because I do think Hongq and Junjie are fantastic team fighters and can take a lot of these games home. So there is room for upside here, but at least for me, in terms of projections, in terms of predictions, it's really difficult for me not to put them, unfortunately, at the bottom at number 5 here. Then moving on to my number 4 team in my power rankings, and this one obviously was a bit more difficult. Number 5 kind of came easy in terms of trying to predict where these teams end up landing, but, there's going to be a toss-up between 1 and 2, and there's a toss-up between 3 and 4, but coming in at number 4 for me, it is going to be Team Liquid, the representative from the LTA, from the Americas here at this first stand tournament, and I ended up settling on TL being number 4 and not number 3, mostly because I'm just a bit concerned about their middle of the map, quite frankly. Going into an international tournament like this, I don't think it's quite as consistent across the board for Team Liquid as it is for a team like K-Corp, who we will talk about a bit later, but TL still has a lot going for them. Trust me, like, if you wanted to put this team at number 3, if you think they have an outsider's chance of upsetting somebody and getting to number 2, like, I don't think it's out of the realm of possibility to be able to say that, and I'll talk about why as we go throughout this segment. I do think that this is a very good team. Their lineup is, of course, looking like Impact in the top lane, in the jungle, APA in the mid lane, Yeon at AD carry, and Core JJ at support. Some really great things to take away here. There's no other place to start, though, other than Yeon. Right now, he is not only the best player in North America, not only the best player in the Americas in general, but it is very clear that, at least in my opinion, going into this tournament, he is the best Western player at the moment. The dude is just absolutely popping off, taking over a lot of games. Like, you can say what you want about K-Corp and about G2, and, like, I agree with you. Trust me, we're going to talk about them later. I have them higher on this list for a reason, but Yeon in particular is, like, an absolute absolute menace. This guy just cannot lose in lane. Like, it is actually physically impossible for him to ever be in a situation where he is not winning, no matter how many resources are pumped into him, no matter what the lane swap situation ever ends up looking like. He's always coming out ahead in terms of gold, and he is always able to pop off in the mid game. This team is not at this tournament without Jan in the AD carry role, and I think if you're looking for reasons to get super excited about Team Liquid, it's Jan. Like, he is absolutely good enough for them to be able to just win a game or two against almost anybody in this tournament if one of the other bot lanes just has one rough game. Like, it is actually that strong. Like, it is a problem for a lot of other teams. They're going to have to figure out a way to consistently deal with him, and from what we've seen internationally, he does show up internationally. Obviously, people are going to look back on 2023 Worlds and have some opinions and some thoughts, but last year, when he really had that breakout, like, he was excellent at both of the international tournaments. They ended up playing both MSI and Worlds, and so I feel pretty good about Jan. I'm certainly not concerned. Core JJ, I think, is arguably playing even better right now than he did last year. I was pretty critical of Core last year, not because I thought he was playing bad, but just because I think Jan was not getting enough credit for doing what he was in the 2v2. I certainly think that Jan was the player pushing this 2v2 forward. Core still trying to adapt to that style. He was always a roam-oriented player. He never felt as comfortable trying to dominate in lane, but I think he's definitely grown into that role, and quite frankly, the start of 2025 has been better, in my opinion, from a tape perspective than what he had in 2024, which is a really good sign. This bot lane is not something I'm concerned about. As far as I'm aware, this is a bot lane that's going to compete to be top 2 or top 3 at the tournament. I don't think they would be ranked anywhere below that. It's just the rest of this team that I have more question marks when it comes to. APA, ironically enough, is not really one of those players. There are a lot of thoughts and opinions and takes out there about APA as a player. I think it's really simple. Like, it comes down to the fact that he is just a very, I don't want to say one-trick pony, because that's not accurate, right? Like, in terms of one trick, you hear that and you think of one champion, or you think of one thing. He just has one style that he likes to go towards. He can play multiple champions in that style, but that style is very much more focused on getting out of lane and getting out of a lot of these skirmishes, getting out on the map and, you know, trying to facilitate the game that way, specifically trying to fight 5v5 in the back half of the game. He is an excellent team fighter that is really, really good at being able to clean up games, very similar to what we just talked about with Hongq, but he does have his problems in lane. He's just not going to be the most consistent 1v1 mid laner in the entire league. He's not going to get the same kind of leads and advantages that you're going to get out of Jan, even with jungle intervention, and that's why you often see him on champions like Azir or Taliyah for two different reasons. Azir, obviously, because it can scale and gives him an out in the late game that he can use to really, like, play his own style, or Taliyah because it gets him out of the laning phase where he generally isn't quite as strong. I think the big cross-up to me is a lot of people talk like this isn't valuable in the West or isn't going to be valuable internationally, that you can't win with a player of this style. There have been plenty of players of this style that have done incredibly well internationally over League's history. Obviously, not a lot of them are, you know, playing in this meta where skirmishes are so accepted, but he's not a bad skirmisher. He's just not a good laner, and I think you can avoid that. You can look back at players like, if you want to go top level of this, and this player was a good laner, just not a great laner, you can look at someone like Crown on Samsung like Galaxy many years ago and see a player that really didn't want to do a ton of stuff in the early game. You can look at someone like Power of Evil, who has succeeded in the West over the past couple of years. Froggen is another player that I think had a style where he just preferred to play those 5v5 team fights, right? Like, players like this have succeeded in the past. I don't necessarily think that APA is like a hindrance on the team in that way. He just is a bit more one-dimensional in terms of the style. He was excellent in the playoffs, though. Really impressed me in terms of his ability to play out a lot of those best of threes, and then obviously the best of 5 in the finals. So I'm hopeful for APA. I think he'll be fine here internationally. It's more the top side of the map that I'm concerned about. Quite frankly, has been the worst player on this team so far in 2025. He had a couple of games domestically that were just horrendous, where he just got completely out-jungled, completely outplayed. He definitely stepped it up and was better as the split went along, as things got a bit more comfortable for them as they got into best of threes in the actual like cross-conference playoffs. He definitely was playing better in that environment, but I think you can make an argument that he's the weakest jungler at this tournament. Whether you want to put him above or below Junjia, I think really is up to you. I think at best he's number 4, and that is a concern for me when it comes to Liquid, and quite frankly, that's one of the biggest reasons why this team comes in at number 4 for me. I've just never been an fan. I've made that very clear on this channel, even going back to my LCK analysis when he was on Bro. I've just never seen him as a particularly consistent player. And quite frankly, Impact has not been exceptionally good to start this year. It's always funny. Like, people criticize me for saying this, but it's kind of rang true. Impact's first year on a new team is unbelievable. He always completely pops off when he changes organizations. Like, go look at his first year on TL in 2018. Go look at his first year on Evil Geniuses. I believe that was 2021. Like, it's somewhere around that range. Go look at his first year on FlyQuest. Even though that team was a disaster, he was doing well. And last year was his first year back on Team Liquid. Everything just seems to click for him. He's at his absolute best when he is playing like fresh on a new team. Subsequent years always do get a little bit more, iffy in terms of the performances, and unfortunately that does seem to be kind of the version that we're getting right now. Again, he has not been a problem. He's not been bad. He's just not been dominant like he was last year. Last year it really was like a two-lane monster for Team Liquid. Top lane and bot lane were both very difficult to deal with in terms of trying to play like 2v2 or 1v1. The enemy team had to allocate resources somewhere, and that meant that APA probably wasn't getting taken advantage of early like he probably should. Was not getting taken advantage of like he should. Like, you had to put so much pressure into either Impact or Yawn to force the other lane to be the only lane that can carry. Now, without Impact being as much of a lane threat as he was last year, Yawn, like, more responsibility has gone onto Yawn and the bot lane and onto APA in the mid lane, who is going to receive more attention from enemy junglers. Fortunately for them, they've stepped up as of so far, and Yawn I'm not concerned about. If this team does run into some problems, it's going to be because the top side of the map, and more specifically the solo laners, might not just be good enough in lane to be able to survive a lot of early pressure from other teams. I definitely think that's possible. Is very much a candidate to just get out jungled in basically any game that he plays because he is so flippy as a player. But once again, the upside of this team is absurd. Like, if you get the version of Team Liquid that we saw in the LTAs where Yawn is up like 1,000 gold by himself at certain times, APA is actively winning fights as mages with great positioning, and Impact is like super stable. Impact and Core are both great as either secondary damage threats or engage threats or something like that, and you can just reel in the early game playing tanks, playing Skarner, playing Maokai, playing Sejuani, those kinds of things. Like, that's the best version of Team Liquid, and that version is good enough to get top 2 or top 3 at this tournament. I just don't know if this team is going to be perfect enough to be able to avoid being taken advantage of in certain ways. We'll have to see moving forward. I have some concerns with TL in general, but this team is definitely talented enough to have a pretty high upside. Then moving on now to number 3 in my power rankings, and you should probably know who this is. Top 2 is pretty locked in. Like I said, 3 and 4 could theoretically be flipped, but I feel good about putting Karmine Corp at number 3, the winners and the number 1 seed from the LEC, from the LoL EMEA Championships. It's a shock to see this team at this tournament, but honestly, it's not an unpleasant surprise to see this team at this tournament. Somebody finally overthrows the kingdom of G2 at the top of the LEC ladder and are able to make a tournament that G2 does not get to attend. This is obviously pretty fantastic for K-Corp just in general, but the fact that so many of these players have stepped up, and honestly, like, they have such a complete roster from top to bot right now in terms of how things are playing out, that's what gives me the confidence to put this team at number 3 over Team Liquid. I think right now they just don't have nearly as many question marks as a team like Team Liquid have, even if I like TL's top-end talent just as much, if not even a little better than I like K-Corp. So I think it's a very fluid situation, but I don't want it to come across like I hate K-Corp in any way. There's a reason I'm putting them above Team Liquid in this sense, and we'll go ahead and get into it. Their lineup is looking like Kana in the top lane, Yike in the jungle, Vladi in the mid lane, Kalist at AD carry, and Targamas at support. All 5 of these players, and I really mean all 5 of them, are in incredible form right now. They're all playing the best league that they have ever played. Maybe, I guess, with the exception of Yike, like, if you really want to go there, but I mean, Yike's been fantastic over the course of this year. They're all peaking at the right time, and it really does make me think, like, what could this team do at a high-end level? We talked about Team Liquid potentially having top 2 upside. K-Corp absolutely has top 2 upside if everything were to go right, and I guess we can honestly just kind of go down the line talking about the strengths and the weaknesses, starting with Kana in the top lane. Like, he's been the best top laner in Europe so far this year, and I don't even really think it's been all that close. He has actually been exceptional. I know a lot of people are still very high on Broken Blade, but quite frankly, from watching the tape, I think Kana is doing more for his team than Broken Blade was doing for his right now. I actually just think that this dude is a monster. He's able to play a lot of the meta champions in a really casual capacity. He can play them strong side or weak side. He can play them early game or late game. Like, his Gnar has been unbelievable. Like, it's been the best Gnar in the world so far to start this this year, the Jace has really only looked good for him. It's been pretty disastrous in basically anybody else's hands. We've talked about that a lot in the LEC. Things like the Mbessa and the Cassante are still big picks for Kana. He can play, like I said, to be a carry if you need him to be. He can play to dominate lane with something like Jace. He can play the Rumble if you need him to pull it out, but he's got the best Gnar ultimates in the world at the moment. Like, this guy is just absolutely taking over. I think this is Kana in really good form. Like, this is T1 Kana in terms of the results that we are getting right now. And if that's the version of him that shows up to this tournament, that is a major issue for every other team at this tournament, because I just don't know how many top laners are going to be able to deal with him really at all, like early or late game, because you don't really know what you're going to get on a game-to-game basis. So I'm really high on Kana. Yike has been unbelievable. I mean, he's been everything I could have asked for, and then some coming over from K-Corp. I mean, I've always been high on Yike. Last year, I was saying, like, Caps and Yike are like carrying the dead weight at times of G2 across the board. Of course, Broken Blade was still pretty good on that team, and he ended up leveling up when it mattered the most, but that bot lane at times was really not performing, and I definitely think Mickey X was kind of running it down for that team at times. Yike was a lot bigger towards the G2 puzzle than he ever got credit for, and clearly he was bigger than G2 thought that he was, because he gets replaced in the offseason. They bring in a rookie in Skewmond and say that they want to go younger. They want somebody that could potentially be a better fit in the long term, because Skewmond is much more of a tank player, somebody who wants to play for late game team fights, and that is obviously the direction that G2 wanted to go in. Yike much more at least known for being a carry player, somebody who wants resources in the jungle, but nah, he's going to go over to K-Corp. He's going to play as Maokai and a Sejuani and a Skarner, and he's going to pick a lot of these more facilitative champions, and he's going to be arguably the best jungler in the LEC. It's actually absurd what he's been able to do for K-Corp. He has been, again, everything this team could have possibly asked for, and then some, and really proving that G2 made a pretty gigantic mistake letting him go in the offseason. I'm not saying that he is the sole reason that K-Corp ended up winning the finals, but what I am going to say is that I believe he's 8 for 8 in finals appearances in terms of winning the championship. If he makes the finals, he wins it. This dude is just a winner at this level. He gets yet another international tournament to go and show that he can be a really good player, and especially with the bottom end of junglers kind of being more up in the air, I think Yike is closer to being around where these Eastern team junglers are than he is to being around where Umti and Junjia are in terms of his performances this year. I really do think he's that good. Vladi has been unreal. I mean, truly, there's nothing else really to say. I think the thing that is the most encouraging about Vladi is just the consistency. Anybody who follows the channel knows that I really value game in and game out consistency, because you kind of can plan around that. It gives a lot more breathing room for other players on your team to be more aggressive and, you know, to be able to take more risks than they normally would. And what Vladi offers is the consistent knowledge of knowing that not only is he going to be able to win lane, but he is going to be able to take over team fights. He just doesn't have bad games. Like, it just doesn't really happen. This guy doesn't really run it down ever. It's actually absurd how consistent he has been domestically, and quite frankly, he massacred Caps in the finals. He is the reason that they are at this tournament. He was finals MVP for a reason, and his gigantic gap of Caps on the other side of that matchup is certainly something you have to take into account. He definitely favors more late game team fighting champions. You can see that at the bottom. Victor, Corki, Azir, it's always been more of a style, even going back to the NLC, but he does it in a way where he's not losing in lane. He's still in really positive and productive positions, and he is more than willing to sacrifice resources in order to help Yike. He's just a very complete player. Every phase of the game he is really good at. There really aren't a lot of flaws to poke into him. Like, he is a superstar in the making. He is well-rounded enough to be that kind of guy. And then there's Kalist and Targamas, who, like, talk about a bot lane that has just exploded, and whatever expectations you had for these two, they definitely blew them out of the water. I know Kalist had unreal expectations going into the year. We heard it in the offseason. G2 offered like a full package of Yike, Hansama, and Mickey X just to get Kalist on their team, and K-Corp said no. They said, no, we want to keep Kalist. We want to build around him. We're not taking this package of winners. They ended up getting Yike anyways, which is obviously very funny, and as it would turn out, Targamas is just as good, if not better, than Mickey X, which we'll get into, which is absurd, but Kalist has been everything that he's been hyped up to be, and I couldn't have even imagined how good he would be in year one. I was concerned that he wasn't going to be that guy from day number one, and I was proven completely wrong on that. Like, I ate my words, and Kalist has been exceptional. This kid's mechanics are just better than everybody else that he's playing against, and like I said, AD carry at this tournament is a role that I think is just so good. It's so dominant. Obviously, the top two that are coming from the Eastern regions are absurd, but like the Western AD carries are like elite level players that I think could really be top of the leaderboards in the LCK LCK or the LPL if they were to go to those regions. That's how good I think both Jan and Kalist are. And then there's Targamas, a player that was discarded, thrown away by multiple teams. G2 didn't want him. They wanted to go back to Mickey X, and at the time that looked right. He goes to Excel and is a disaster. He goes to K-Corp last year and is a disaster, but Kalist clearly makes it clear that he wants to play with Targamas as his support when he enters the LEC. And here's Targamas. Here's like the best version of him that we have ever seen in the LEC. It's actually ridiculous how well he's been playing. He was their best playoff player throughout like all of the best of 3 stage. Obviously, Vladi was probably a bit better going into the best of 5s, but when you specifically talk about like the best of 3s, the beginning part of the playoffs, Targamas was winning every single series for K-Corp. It's absurd how good he has been, and again, that just completes this super talented roster from top to bot. Like, could you sit here and say that like Jan and Core are probably better than Kalist and Targamas? I would make that argument, but I don't think it's like locked in for sure. But sure, like Jan and Core are exceptionally good. Kalist and Targamas are certainly not as proven on the international stage. But when you look at the rest of this roster, like Kalist and Targamas aren't that far behind, and K-Corp are almost certainly better in every other role. And so you just feel really good about this team's success. I think they have top 2 upside if one of the Eastern teams does end up underperforming. And honestly, like if this team really lives up to their potential and they continue to get better as they have basically throughout the year, who's to say they can't compete to win the finals? I mean, they really are that talented. This team has very few weaknesses. I think if you're looking for one, it's just a lack of experience. Most of these players have never played internationally. Vladi, Kalist have never, I shouldn't say most, under half, but Vladi and Kalist have never played internationally. Targamas only played, I believe, at 2022 Worlds. I think that is the only time he's ever played internationally. Of course, Yike has plenty of experience on G2. Kana has plenty of experience from his time in the LCK, but this is not a team that's super practiced, internationally, not nearly as practiced as a lot of the players on Team Liquid who are below them, even players on the Flying Oysters who are below them. So that's really the only concern, is they just don't have the track record to prove that they can guarantee do it. But in terms of the talent, in terms of what the tape has shown, there's no reason to believe this team should be ranked anything below number 3. But that's going to bring us to the top 2 teams in my power rankings for this video. It's the expected top 2 teams. I don't think anybody's getting surprised by the teams that are remaining, but what order will they come in? Well, coming in at number 2 for me in my power rankings, it is going to be Top Esports, the representative from the LPL, from the LoL Professional League. And I really do think that this team has top 1 upside, but I just can't quite get across the line with them being better than HLE on paper, because I just don't think that they are better than HLE on paper. I think that there are reasons to believe that their confidence coming into this tournament might push them above maybe what expectations are. I also think that generally the format of the tournament actually really favors them in comparison to a team like Hanwha Life, who's very good in the Fearless format. HLE really excels at being pushed down in the champion priority because so many of their players can play so many different champions. That's not really going to be the case for this tournament in particular, for the group stage at the very least. That's where I think Top Esports could actually really shine and really look good as a team. And it's not like they don't have the talented players to back that up. It's not like you're looking at a roster that's just, pretty good, but not on the same level as HLE. You could make the argument that a lot of these players are talented enough to be number 1 in their role at this tournament. I'm not going to be making that argument in most cases. There are definitely going to be some borderline ones. We'll talk about that, but Top Esports pretty cleanly came in at number 2 in my power rankings. Their lineup is, of course, looking like 369 in the top lane, Kanavi in the jungle, Cream in the mid lane, Jackie Levitt AD carry, and Crisp at support. Everybody on this page will be familiar to longtime international fans and, of course, to people who watch this channel. The only one who's going to be a little bit more shocking is, I guess, Cream, but, like, come on. If you don't know who Cream is at this point, you're just not paying attention. This guy has absolutely blown up, and quite frankly, we can start with him. We can start talking about him because I really do think he is, like, the piece that makes this entire engine move for Top Esports. I'm not saying that he's, like, the best player on the team because I don't believe that that is the case. I think Kanavi and Jackie Love very much fight it out for being the best players on this team, but Cream was so influential for why Top Esports had the ability to play through a lot of those players throughout the playoffs, because he was going toe-to-toe with all of the best mid laners in the history of the LPL and coming out on top. It's actually ridiculous the road that he had to beat in order to get here. We talk about it all the time on the LPL broadcast, but he had to go through Rookie and then Doenby and then Knight and then Scout and then obviously Shanks in the finals in order to get to this tournament. It's ridiculous, the cavalcade of legendary mid laners that Cream had to overcome, and quite frankly, for a lot of that playoff run, he was Top Esports best player. He was playing incredibly well. He has this reputation of being a bit of a Zeka type player, which is funny. We'll talk about Zeka a bit later in this video, but Definitely somebody who prefers assassins and melee assassins at that, made his name on champions like Ari and Silas for a long time, and then last year he comes to top esports, he gets picked up from OMG, where he's been kind of a rising, growing star for a long time, and he really adapts his game to being more of a facilitator. He works really well in the marksman meta last year, and then coming out this year, like, he's played Orianna and Hui the most of any champions. Like, this guy has just grown into being such a complete mid laner. He can be a carry presence out of the middle of the map. It's the reason that I was so excited on him in the first place, why he was, like, pretty officially the first channel darling that I ever crowned on this channel way back in 2022. But, like, he has grown into being such a well-rounded player in terms of playing mages and in terms of playing to not win 1v1 and trying to help out the rest of his team, making his jungle look like $1 million, which he did both last year and this year. I think Cream is just really, really talented, and I think he has made this team a lot better. He is the engine that makes everything tick, and I think that's why everything else ends up working out here, but everything else is working out. We'll just say that. Navi has been excellent so far to start the year. He's not been perfect. I think that there are some games that you can look at and be a little bit more critical, especially in terms of his mid games, where I still think he's trying to find out what he's supposed to be doing on the new map. Like, I don't think he's making a ton of mistakes or anything like that. He's not walking in and dying, but he's certainly not been the most consistent player in that phase of the game. But outside of that, his early games are still arguably the best in the world in terms of being able to generate resources and just making sure the enemy jungler has no ways to play the game. It's very Canyon-esque. Navi has always been that kind of player, and he continues to really take over in that way. And his team fighting is still excellent. He still can play things like Sejuani and Viego and get a lot of resets, but things like Vi make a lot of sense because it gives him proactivity throughout a lot of the mid game, and that's why they've been going for a lot of these more, you know, Vi, Ari, or a lot more proactive mid-jungle duos like that, because they do want to be able to get out on the map. That's something I would definitely be prepping for if I was going up against top esports, but we know Kanavi can play anything. We just talked about how Cream has gotten more versatile. The middle of this map has become even more difficult to deal with, and I think Kanavi could have an unreal tournament. He really is set into a good position to be able to especially destroy a lot of the weaker competition in the jungle matchup. You have 369 on the top side, who throughout the playoffs just kept getting better and better. I was a little bit concerned about 369. You know, this team lost a best of 5 in the regular season to Anyone's Legend, and I think a lot of that can be pointed to 369 not being as good as a player like Flandre on the other side of that matchup. But again, he's gotten better and better as games have gone along. It feels like he is slowly working his way back up to being what he was in spring of last year. I was getting concerned with his form in summer because it definitely dipped a little bit, but as a player, he has definitely grown back into being, you know, the very versatile, very dangerous to stop carry top laner that we kind of know him to be. He can play weak side. He definitely showed that on JD Gaming specifically in 2023, but he is definitely more of a carry player. He feels a lot more comfortable when he gets to play things like Jace, another very good Jace player at this tournament, but the Gnar, the Cassante, they're going to be high prio as well. Very similar champion pool to someone like Kana on K-Corp. It's going to be interesting to see how those two match up against each other. They had to have played against each other before at some international tournament, but either way, I'm very excited to see them in the form that they're in. Then you've got Jackie Love and Crisp as the bot lane. Obviously, two very polarizing players, but I think both of them have really established what they are at the pro level. Not that that means you know you're going to get anything particular out of them from a game in and game out perspective, but Jackie Love has gotten a lot more consistent. I've actually really been pushing this narrative on the channel for the past year and a half or so, where Jackie Love obviously has gained a reputation of being very feast or famine. Like, he can take over games, he can be the most dominant AD carry in the world with his mechanics, but sometimes he's going to be over-aggressive, put himself in some bad positions, he's going to have more deaths than maybe you would like individually as an AD carry player. That narrative isn't as true in the last couple of years as maybe you would think. He has really settled in as just like being one of the best AD carries in the world. Again, I was saying that he was the MVP of the LPL in 2023 when he missed Worlds, and you know, last year I thought he was really exceptionally good for a top esports team that was just really stacked elsewhere. He was getting no resources from his team and still being incredibly productive, and he's still doing that. Look at his most played champions: Ashe, Ezreal, Misfortune. Like, the entire idea with Jackie Love right now is not to put him on hyper carries, is not to let him take over in the back half of the game, but to like utilize his mechanical skill and his mechanical advantage that he has on basically everybody that he plays against in order to just get advantages elsewhere on the map, because you know that he's going to be useful. Like, his Ashe is absurd. The damage he's able to output on that champion is ridiculous. You could say similar things about Misfortune, who not a lot of people are winning on right now, but Jackie Love has found a ton of success at being able to pilot that champion, especially against really good teams. And so I think that's what makes Jackie Love so special and why I think he kind of completes the core of this team with Kanavi and Cream. Like, their three playstyles all come together to really create something very interesting because Cream is so versatile, because Kanavi is definitely so early game focused, and because Jackie Love doesn't really need resources. It really creates this identity where if you can get these very hyper mobile champions out on the map, you can win basically any skirmish that you come across, and that's how Top Esports ended up getting here, and Crisp really does play into that. I know some people have some strong opinions about Crisp individually as a player. I certainly do as well. There are going to be games where he looks great and there are going to be games where he looks awful, but that's because he is always looking to be the biggest playmaker in the game. Like, people just have to understand who Crisp is. He is not a player that is going to try and take the obvious engage or the obvious route. He's going to try to find some unbelievably crazy flank angle, and when it does work, like, it's the best in the world. There is nobody more creative in League of Legends than Crisp. I am very willing to say that. There is nobody who looks for more unique and interesting ways to play out team fights than Crisp, but sometimes that does come back to bite him. That's why you're going to see some bad games out of him every once in a while. So far this year, it's been a really big positive. Him and Jackie Love have worked really well together as a duo, and I'm hoping that that very much continues, but if you see a bad game every once in a while from Crisp, you're not going to be surprised. He is definitely somebody that is more feast or famine. That is definitely the kind of player that can lose you a game, but he can instantly win you a game with a couple of the engage opportunities that he's had over the course of this year. And so Top Esports is just so interesting to talk about. They have so many different pieces that all tie together in very interesting ways. I really do think the middle of the map is the most important part here for Top. I think Kanavi and Cream in particular are really going to determine a lot. If they can show up and quite frankly be better than Peanut and Zeka on the other side of this matchup, which I think is super possible, there is no reason to believe they could not win the first stand tournament, be the best team at this first international. I think that that's possible because I just value the consistency of those players a lot. It's hard for me to predict that right now. I think there are some concerns that Crisp is just going to lose you a game or two, and then, is that going to be overcomable against some of the better teams at this tournament, against, the top team coming out of the LCK? I don't know. Like, Jackie Love is not getting put on hyper carries. I would honestly feel a bit better if they had at least showcased the ability to want to put Jackie Love on some hyper carries throughout this year. Again, Cream has played more assassins as of late, but you don't want to get pigeonholed into one style, which is kind of what they've been so far this year, is one style. So there are positives and negatives to Top Esports. You can definitely have some negative takeaways, but there is just no way, in my opinion, you could possibly rank this team below number 2. But that's going to bring us to my number 1 team in my power rankings, and obviously by process of elimination, you know who that is by this point. Number 1 for me is going to be Hanwha Life Esports from the LCK, the team that won Korea this past split, and I just couldn't really, in good faith, give it to any other team. I do believe that on paper, this is the best team at the tournament. I think you're arguably looking at the best player in all 5 roles, although I think that is relatively debatable for a position like jungle, at least in terms of 2025 form. Maybe really, if you want to go down that road, like a position like top lane or bot lane, I think could be up in the air. But for the most part, I'm looking at this team as the team to beat going into first stand. And I think they're looking at themselves as the team to beat going into first stand. Not only because they are incredibly stacked as a roster and got here for a reason, but because the LCK has been incredibly dominant at international tournaments over the past, 800 years, if we really want to go back that far. But really, specifically, like, recent history has very much favored the LCK, which I think gave me the go-ahead to say HLE are the favorites going into this. Their lineup is, of course, looking like Zeus in the top lane, Peanut in the jungle, Zeka in the mid lane, Viper at AD carry, and Delight at support. Again, I think that there are arguments to be made that a couple of these players are just the best players in their roles in the world. The one player that might not come to mind first for you in that specific circumstance, but for me has become increasingly obvious, is Delight in the support position. We're actually going to talk about the bot lane first because I really don't think there is an argument, at least in terms of the tape right now. Delight has been the best support in the world in 2025. The things that this guy is doing for HLE are astounding. He is stabilizing this team when they need it the most in a lot of key situations. People forget HLE was going through some problems, we'll just say, in the regular season. They were on the losing side of the group swap, the group Baron versus group Elder LCK format. They had to go through the play-in stage, and they had to go through the Game 5 gauntlet that everybody talks about so much. But the reason they were in that position to begin with is because so many of these players just refused to be consistent. Zeus had a really bad group stage, was not particularly good on the top side. Peanut was actively losing games for this team. Zeka and Viper were super flippy and not really consistent at all. It was Delight that was really holding down the success rate of this team and, quite frankly, just winning a lot of games for HLE. And I don't think he's going to be getting that kind of credit. There have been times in the past where I've been a Delight hater, but talk about a guy who's just gotten better year over year over year, over and over again. It feels like every single game I've watched of Delight, he has gotten better, and it's yet to stop. Like, the ascension is yet to, like, come to a halt. The graph is still pointing up. Like, that's where Delight is at right now. Again, in terms of tape, I really do believe he has been the best support in the world in 2025. And if he has that kind of success coming into this tournament, especially because you're looking at a team like Top Esports being big competition and Crisp is very exploitable as a player that you could potentially take advantage of, like, that could be what seals the deal for HLE. But it's not like he's playing with some scrub AD carry. He's got Viper as his ADC here, and you know what? Viper might be the best AD carry in the world. He's had some inconsistencies at the start of this year. Everybody on Hanwha Life has. His bad games have actually been really bad. Even in their playoff run, a lot of their losses in their playoff run, or a lot of the reasons they're going to Game 5 in a lot of these series is because Viper will have 1 or 2 games where he just runs it in a series. Like, it's actually been absurd how common that's been happening. His consistency is just not there right now. He's never been a player that's done fantastic without resources. He's definitely a resource-heavy AD carrier, or at least that's always been his preferred method to play. But I think Delight, you know, coming into his own has definitely made it easier on Viper. I think this bot lane duo, when it's clicking, is arguably the best in the world. I think that there is certainly, again, an argument to be made there. There's just been some inconsistency on Viper that has concerned me. Again, you could say the same thing about the top side of the map here, Zeus and Peanut. Zeus I'm less concerned about because in the best of fives, like in the playoffs, he just was exceptionally good. He was winning lane, even in losing games, and even in losing matchups. Like, Zeus just looked so much better once he finally, like, got used to playing with the rest of these players. He's obviously the big new addition for HLE, the multiple-time world champion coming over from T1, and he was exceptionally good in their playoff run. So, on things like Cassante, Gnar, Jace, we've talked about them a lot. They're the good top laners right now. Zeus is still going to be able to perform very well on them. Peanut is a very interesting case because I would also say that he's kind of the cross between Zeus and Viper in terms of the form that he's in, where I was like, Zeus was kind of bad in the regular season, but really showed up when it mattered in the playoffs. And Viper, while he had great moments in the regular season and great moments in the playoffs, was just not particularly consistent. Peanut's kind of the hybrid of that, where he wasn't very good in the regular season, was kind of letting this team down, and his bad games in the playoffs are still kind of bad. Like, when he loses, he still loses kind of hard, but oh boy, those good games are so unbelievably good. His Nidalee has been basically unstoppable so far, which is very funny considering all the memes about it last year. As long as you don't put him on things like Zyra or even really Xin Zhao, like, these have not been particularly successful champions for him. He has been dominant. He's still the best Sejuani Maokai player in the world. His ability to facilitate for the rest of this team is still second to none in that regard, and I still believe he can be the best jungler at this tournament. Whether I would rank him as that over someone like Kanavi, it's difficult because I just don't think he's in the best form of his career at the current moment. I've, definitely valued his tape the last 3 years more than I value the limited sample size that we've seen in 2025 so far. But again, his best games are as good as anybody else's in the entire world. Like, we know what Peanut can do at a top level. And then you've got Zeka in the mid lane, who, shout out Top Esports. I like Top Esports. Zeka is just a further along version of Cream. And when you're talking about which one of these two teams is going to be in a better spot because of that, obviously, you have to look at Hanwha Life. Like, Cream's best case outcome is that he turns into Zeka one day, a player that is kind of known for being more of a one-style kind of player, is definitely more known for the Yone and more known for the Akali and the Sylas and, all of those melee assassin champions, but has grown into being a much more versatile player, has been great as a facilitator and an out-of-lane player on things like Galio throughout this year. It's really kind of been a primary pick for Hanwha Life Esports, and, of course, can still carry on things like Azir, as he has shown in the past. He's just a very well-rounded player with ridiculous mechanics, and he is the most clutch player in the world. If you put him in a do or die game number 5, you can expect him to be the best player on the Rift because he does it every single time. The higher the stakes, the more important the game, the better Zeka ends up playing, which gives me a lot of confidence here for the first stand tournament. So it's hard for me not to look at this team full of players that I just expect to be so good in these big moments, who had to go through so much adversity domestically to not do well at this tournament. But there was a reason they had to go through so much adversity in the playoffs and go through all that in the first place. It's because there were underperformances from this team domestically. I think if you get some of those games out of Peanut and Zeus and Viper and even Zeka to an extent, then that's going to be a problem for HLE. You can't have those games show up in a series against Top Esports. You can't have those problems show up in a series even against K-Corp. Like, they're good enough teams to be able to take advantage of those mistakes. But if everything is right for Hanwha Life, if this is the version of the team that we got in the finals against Gen G, or really throughout the playoffs just in general, like in winners finals against D plus Kia, that version, at least to me, is pretty clearly the strongest team in the tournament on paper. Alright, but that is going to do it for my First Stand 2025 Power Rankings and Primer video. I do hope you guys enjoyed. For a recap, that is the CTBC Flying Oysters in 5th, it's Team Liquid in 4th, it's K-Corp in 3rd, it's Top Esports at 2nd, and it's Hanwha Life Esports in 1st place, and my prediction to win the First Stand tournament here in 2025. Of course, a lot of things can go differently. I sure hope it goes differently, but with only 5 teams at the tournament, you know, we could be seeing some definite tiers formed. I'm curious to hear you guys' thoughts and opinions on my thoughts and opinions down in the comment section below. Where do you agree? Where do you disagree? Who is too high and who is too low? Who did I not hype up enough in terms of my overall analysis when I talked about each team? Is there anything playstyle-wise that you think was important to mention that maybe I left out? Always curious to hear your thoughts and opinions on everything down in the comment section below, but that's gonna do it. I do hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, leave a like. It really does mean a lot to me. Lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it does help get this video out to a lot more people, which I'm always very appreciative of. If you're new here, hit the subscribe button. We'll be covering every single game at the First Stand tournament on this channel over the course of the next week. All of the group stage, all of the round robin, and then of course the semifinals and the finals on this channel. So if you're interested in all of that stuff, hit subscribe and hit that bell so you can be notified when those videos do go live. But of course, with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day. And I will see you all later.